Not the heavy kind of quiet you see in movies, the ordinary kind. A clock ticking, a radiator humming, someone coughing in the back row. At the defense table sat a man named Walter Briggs, 68 years old, brown jacket, hands folded so tight his knuckles had gone white. He looked to anyone walking in like a man who had already lost. Then the door opened. 3 women walked in, mid-20s to early 30s, coats still damp from the rain. A teacher, a nurse, a social worker. They didn't say a word. They just walked past the prosecutor, past the bailiff, and sat down in the front row behind Walter. He didn't see them at first, and when he did, he forgot how to breathe, because for almost 20 years, those 3 women had called him Dad. Before we go further, if you've ever known someone who quietly carried other people through life, someone the world overlooked, stay with me. This story is for them. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read everyone. Now, let me take you back to where this all started. A small mill town in western Pennsylvania. Spring of 2003. Walter Briggs worked the night shift at Lincoln Avenue Elementary. He was the custodian, the janitor, the Mr. B the kids waved at when they forgot something at school. His wife Doris had passed in 2001, cancer. They'd tried for children for years. It never happened. After Doris died, Walter sold their house and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on 6th Street. He kept her wedding ring on a chain around his neck. He worked nights because the silence at home was worse than the silence at the school. He vacuumed classrooms. He sharpened pencils kids had left dull. He picked up lost mittens and put them in the lost and found box. And every Friday he stayed an extra hour to scrub the cafeteria floors, even though nobody asked him to. The principal, Mrs. Alvarado, used to say Walter was the only employee she'd ever met who treated a public school like it was his own living room. He was 48 years old. He had no children. He thought that was how the rest of his life would go. He was wrong. It was a Tuesday in October, cold rain, the kind that gets into your bones. Walter was locking up around 11. He heard something behind the cafeteria dumpster. A small sound, not an animal. He walked over with his flashlight. 3 girls, soaked through, backpacks on, sitting on a piece of cardboard. The oldest stood up fast and put her arms around the other 2. Please don't call anybody, please. Her name was Maya. She was 10. The middle one was Eliza. She was 8. The youngest, hiding behind Maya's leg, was Joelle. She was 6. Walter learned later what had happened. Their mother had died of an overdose 3 weeks earlier. There was no father in the picture. They'd been placed with a foster family 2 towns over, a family that took the state's check and locked the pantry at night. Maya had taken her sisters and walked 12 miles, following the train tracks. She'd remembered passing the school once on a field trip and figured it would be warm. Now, here is where this story becomes real, because Walter did not take them home that night. He couldn't. Legally, morally, he knew that. What he did was this. He brought them inside the school. He turned the heat up in the teacher's lounge. He gave them the granola bars from his lunch bag and a thermos of warm milk from the cafeteria fridge. And then he picked up the phone and called Mrs. Alvarado at home. Mrs. Alvarado called the county. The county called Child Protective Services. By 2 in the morning, a caseworker named Renee Holloway was sitting on the floor of the teacher's lounge with 3 exhausted little girls and a janitor who refused to leave until they were safe. That's how it started. Not with a man secretly raising 3 orphans in his apartment. With a phone call, the right one. Here's something most people don't know. In Pennsylvania, in most states actually, ordinary people can become licensed foster parents. It takes about 6 months. Background checks, home inspections, classes on trauma-informed care. Walter started the paperwork the next week. Renee, the caseworker, told him straight. A single man, 60 hours a week on the night shift, 1-bedroom apartment. The system was not going to hand him 3 children. Not easily. So Walter got to work. He moved out of the apartment above the dry cleaner. He rented a small 2-bedroom on Maple Street, peeling paint but a yard. He switched to the day shift, even though it paid less, so he could be home at night. He took every class the agency required, sat in the front row, took notes in a spiral notebook. It took 14 months. 14 months of supervised visits. Of the girls staying in a group home. Of Walter driving 40 minutes every Saturday with a tin of homemade cookies, even when Joelle wouldn't talk to him for the first 6 visits because she was scared of getting attached again. In January 2005, the family court judge, a woman named Judge Patricia Yoon, signed the order. Walter Briggs became the legal kinship-style foster parent of Maya, Eliza, and Joelle. 2 years after that, he adopted them. He always said the day he signed those adoption papers was the proudest day of his life. Prouder than his wedding. He told Doris that out loud at her grave. He hoped she wasn't mad. Raising 3 girls on a custodian's salary is not a fairy tale. I want to be honest about that. There were months Walter ate cereal for dinner so the girls could have chicken. There was a Christmas in 2008 when the only present under the tree was a used bicycle he'd fixed up from a yard sale and repainted in the school's auto shop. There was a parent-teacher conference where Walter showed up in his work uniform, navy blue, name patch, smelling faintly of bleach, and overheard another parent mutter, "Is that the dad?" He pretended not to hear. But here is what the town didn't see. A community showed up. Mrs. Alvarado quietly arranged free school lunches and waived field trip fees. The Lincoln Avenue PTA started leaving bags of clothes on the porch, anonymously, so Walter wouldn't feel embarrassed. A retired teacher named Mr. Goldfarb tutored Eliza in math for free every Wednesday for 6 years. The local food pantry, the library, a nurse at the clinic who never charged a copay. Walter did not raise those girls alone. He raised them with help. He accepted that help. He said thank you. That mattered too. Maya, the oldest, became student council president. She got a full scholarship to Penn State. Eliza got into a nursing program at a community college on a Pell Grant. Worked 2 jobs through school. Joelle, the quiet one, took longer to find her path. She worked at a diner for a year after high school before going back for a social work degree. None of them came from money. All of them got there. That's not a movie. That's what happens when one person decides to show up and a community decides not to look away. Walter retired from the school district in 2022, 66 years old, a small pension. He stayed in the house on Maple Street. In the spring of last year, he started getting letters from the school district, then from a lawyer. The district had been audited, several $1,000s worth of supplies, cleaning chemicals, paper goods, cafeteria items, had gone missing over the previous 2 years. Inventory records were a mess. Somebody needed to be blamed. The new superintendent, hired 6 months earlier, pointed at Walter. He'd had keys, he'd had access. He'd retired right around when the discrepancies showed up. That, the district claimed, was not a coincidence. They filed a civil suit. theft of public property, asking for restitution and the freezing of his pension. Now listen, this is the part that matters. The case was thin. Anyone reading the file could see it. Walter had been retired for 8 months by the time most of the missing inventory disappeared. He didn't even have his keys anymore. But Walter was a 68-year-old retired custodian with a public defender on a civil matter, which, in most states, you don't even get a free lawyer for. He couldn't afford a real attorney, and the district was banking on that. Walter didn't tell the girls. He told himself they had their own lives, their own bills, their own kids now. Maya had a baby boy. He didn't want to be a burden. He was going to lose his pension and his house, quietly, without making a fuss. That was the plan. Until Maya's husband saw the court filing in the public records and asked her casually over dinner, "Hey, is your dad okay? I want to be careful here, because I want to tell you the truth." The 3 sisters did not march into court and save Walter with a dramatic legal performance. That's not how the law works. That's not how any of this works. What they did was both smaller and bigger than that. Maya, now an elementary school teacher in Pittsburgh, drove down that weekend and read every page of the case file out loud at the kitchen table. Eliza, a hospice nurse, took 2 weeks of unpaid leave to stay with Walter so he wasn't alone. Joelle, the social worker, knew people. She made calls. She found him a real lawyer, pro bono, a woman named Teresa Vance, who had handled wrongful termination cases for school employees for 30 years. The sisters didn't argue the case. They couldn't. None of them were attorneys. What they did was show up. They sat in the front row at every hearing, in their work clothes, so the judge could see who Walter Briggs was, so the district's lawyers could see. Every single time they looked up, 3 women who knew exactly the kind of man they were trying to ruin. Teresa Vance did the legal work. She subpoenaed the inventory records. She found the gaps. She found the new vendor contracts the superintendent had signed. Contracts where the numbers didn't add up. The case fell apart in 3 hearings. The judge dismissed it. The district paid Walter's legal fees. 6 months later, the superintendent quietly resigned. That's the real ending. Not a courtroom miracle. Just a community that finally looked up. I'll tell you the moment that stayed with me. After the dismissal, Walter walked out of the courthouse. It was raining. Of course it was raining. It always rains in this town. He stood on the courthouse steps with Teresa Vance and his 3 daughters, and a reporter from the local paper asked him for a quote. Walter thought about it for a long time, long enough that the reporter started to put her notebook away. Then he said this: "I wasn't a hero. I was a janitor. I cleaned floors for 40 years and nobody noticed. The girls aren't here today because of what I did. They're here because somebody finally treated me like a person. That's all anybody is asking for, just to be treated like a person." The reporter wrote it down. She put it on the front page. "Here's what I want you to take from this. Walter Briggs did not save 3 orphan girls by himself. A school principal made a phone call. A caseworker stayed up all night. A judge signed an order. A community brought clothes. A retired teacher tutored math. A lawyer worked for free. What Walter did, the quiet, ordinary, repeatable thing, was decide, on a cold, rainy Tuesday, that 3 children behind a dumpster were worth picking up the phone for. That's the part any of us can do. The phone call, the form, the Saturday visit, the seat in the courtroom. You don't have to be extraordinary to change a life. You just have to refuse to look away. If this story meant something to you, do me one favor. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with one person who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere right now there is a Walter, and somewhere there are 3 kids behind a dumpster. The only question is whether the rest of us pick up the phone. I'll see you in the next one.